If all this is news to you, and you are even offended, here is another example, which is somewhat longer, and I'll examine it in more detail. In the second book of Samuel, chapter 24, we have this story, or incident. As before, I'm not going to read this story from beginning to end, as there are 17 verses, but the summary is that David, the king of Israel, decides to carry out a census so that he knows how many men are available for his army. As you will see in the first line, it was God who told him to do this. There are so many mistakes and contradictions on every level that it's difficult to know where to start. Here is a list. Number 1. God does not tempt people. People are led by their own desires to be tempted or to sin. He is also less likely to tempt people when he is angry and just wipe everybody out. It's unclear why it was wrong for David to count the number of fighting men eligible for the army, but he repents anyway and admits his mistake. How could the writers say that, when only a couple of verses previously they had written that God had made him do it? Number 3. God then apparently invents 3 punishments from which David has to choose one. How could this happen when God already knew it was himself that started it all? Number 4. God apparently carries out the chosen punishment, and many thousands of people die in a plague. Again, how could he do this, when apparently it was his fault in the first place? I could continue, but I won't. Mistakes proved or not. This is fairly typical of the stories in the Bible, which is why we need to tread very carefully and not take things too literally. Most Bible stories do not have a great number of inconsistencies like this one has, but nevertheless this story is typical in its exaggeration, as you will see as we continue. Next we need to establish whether there is a pattern which actually exists in the pages of the Bible. If you can find a pattern, then you will know that I am not trying to establish a particular viewpoint. This would be the same as saying, let's study the nearest planets in our solar system and see if they all rotate the same way. If they do, then we have established a pattern and not a viewpoint. There are many patterns in the Bible, such as the problem of God being made responsible for both good and evil in equal measures. But as I have already mentioned exaggeration, let's continue with that theme, exaggeration. In Judges 15 we have the story of Samson and the 300 foxes. In this story Samson was about to marry, but his future father-in-law had changed his mind and given his daughter away to another man. Samson got rather angry and burnt all the fields which belonged to the Philistines and his father-in-law. In revenge, the Philistines burnt the father-in-law and daughter to death. The story continues, but this is quite enough to be going on with for now. The first part of the story of Samson is impossible on all levels. I can accept miracles, but this story is not a miracle story. In order to burn the fields, Samson catches 300 foxes and ties their tails together, lights their tails and lets them loose in the fields. How long would it take to find and capture one fox alive? A day? A week? A month? Now multiply that by 300. How large a farm or ranch would you have to build to feed and house those foxes as and when you caught them? How difficult would it be to tie their tails together and then attach a burning torch without some form of sedation? And what was the point of the whole exercise, when he could have walked into the fields himself and burnt the crops by his own efforts? And why did the Philistines take revenge on the father-in-law and his daughter when they hadn't actually done anything wrong? Is this exaggeration or not? So if you agree that these stories are full of inconsistencies and exaggerations, then we should read the Bible in a particular way. We should take the approach which says something like, this incident may well have happened, but not quite as it says. If we take this approach with all the stories and accounts in the Bible, I can assure you that you will not go far wrong. If we dismiss the story altogether and apply the same reasoning to all the Bible stories and dismiss them as well, we actually lose something important called prophecy. And if we lose the prophecies, then we have lost everything, as you will see later. We must realise that all Bible stories were handed down over centuries by word of mouth, and anyone who has played the game Chinese Whispers will know that anything which is passed on in that way gets changed. If a single sentence can alter with 5 or 6 people over a couple of minutes, how much change do you think will happen over hundreds of years? The next story or incident is in Exodus 15 and is the famous crossing of the sea by Moses and the Israelites as they escaped slavery in Egypt. This story is slightly different to the story of Samson in that it is a miracle story. We all love a miracle, and pretty well everyone believes that this story actually happened, as it is a major incident in the history of the ancient Hebrews. But my question is the same as for the Samson story and the David story. Did it happen how it's described, or is there evidence of exaggeration? Well, a miracle is a miracle and therefore cannot strictly be classed as an exaggeration. Here is a definition. An event that is contrary to the established laws of nature and usually attributed to a supernatural cause. Personally, I have no problem with miracles. The universe is a miracle, how life started is a miracle, and that we have a Bible in any shape or form at all is a miracle. So where is the exaggeration? Well, there is a continuing theme or pattern throughout the Old Testament that God is responsible for everything, from the moment that you get up in the morning and have breakfast to the time that you go to bed, from the time you're born to the time you die. He causes everything to happen that has happened, even illness, disease, disability, and dying in a flood. This is another pattern and is a result of how the people thought 3,000 years ago. It was reality to them. The Egyptians had thousands of gods to explain one thing at a time. The ancient Hebrews had one God who explained everything. It is not reality to us, but we just have to accept that this is why the Bible is written the way it is. I will examine this problem later, but for now let's examine how exaggeration is applied to the story of crossing the sea on dry land. I have written this story again, but only left in the parts which mention that God did it, or God said it. There are 18 of these in 31 verses. Of course, I'm not doubting that God can do all this, and much more besides. But what we need to ask ourselves is, does it make sense? Of course it makes sense when God can and does perform miracles, and it makes even more sense from the writer's point of view, because it's vitally important that God receives the praise. Unfortunately, this is its weakness, and the weakness of all the Bible stories. The more fantastic the story, the more God is praised. So again, it fits the pattern that we are trying to establish, that a perfectly reasonable and credible story is added to until the original version has been virtually lost. We shouldn't be surprised by this. If a story was overdone, expanded or intensified, it was considered a compliment because God could then be given more praise. I'm fairly certain that this story is true, or put another way, I have faith that these things happened, but not quite the way the storyteller says it did. The ancient tribe of Semites, as they are called in an Egyptian record, did leave Egypt at some point, and the Egyptians probably chased after them. It is more likely that the crossing of the sea came about by natural processes and good timing, rather than by a miracle. But then, of course, the good timing itself could be classed as a miracle. If you've ever been caught out by a rising tide, or seen the tide surge on the River Severn, or walked in a dry river bed which has suddenly filled up because of rain hundreds of miles away in the hills, you will know what I mean. There is also another problem attached to this particular story, the problem of archaeology and history. According to the Old Testament, Moses was one of the most important people in Jewish history, and yet there is no mention of him by that name in any records or writings of the same period outside the Bible. And it's worth mentioning that the Egyptians were very good at keeping records. There is mention of several other people who led uprisings at this time, but no one actually called Moses. Also, according to the Old Testament, the capture and slavery of the Israelites and their subsequent revolt, 10 plagues, and escape was also one of the most important events in Jewish history, remembered even today by what is called the Passover. Do these events get a mention outside the Bible? Well, actually they do, in a record called the Ipuwer Papyrus. But again, this record is nothing like the Exodus record. So the historical record is inconclusive, which is what we might expect it to be. If you have listened to any of my other videos, you will be familiar with my theory of no evidence but many clues. So does this story of the crossing of the sea contain exaggerations? And does it fit the pattern we're trying to establish, that the writers are overly enthusiastic to give praise to God? I think it does. But we must move on to the next story.